Hi, thank you very much for the kind of invitation to talk with you today. I'm going to talk about population and species losses, the sixth mass extinction, and the future of humanity. Many years ago, the great Aldo Leopold said that we live in a world of wounds. And if we look around, this is really what is happening. The place is covered by wounds that we have created on Earth by our activities. And what I do as a scientist, well, I am an ecologist from the National University of Mexico. And what I do as a scientist is basically a basic research. I love to do research, but then that research, I do it with try to conservation of endangered species, the establishment and management of protected areas, conservation policies and outreach. With my study group, for example, we have been able to create almost 2% of the Mexican land converted into protected areas. We work with jaguar, we work with prairie dog, we work with bison. And we do a conservation policy in the sense that we tried that our research, what we find in our research, become models and then become policies throughout the country. Some of the facts that are very important to know is the first one, probably to understand the magnitude of the extinction problem, is that only 1% of the global biodiversity, it is known. Only 1%, meaning most of the species, alive, plants, animals, and microorganisms, are unknown to science. That means that every time that we destroy a forest, we're destroying literally hundreds of thousands, even millions of species that are known to science. And an example, in the last 10 years, we have discovered more of 600 species of mammals. Since 2000, we have discovered 80 new species of monkeys. Just this year, between December and last December, 2 new species of whale were discovered in the waters of Mexico and the US, one in the Gulf and one in the Pacific. That's the magnitude, that's the wealth of the species that live on Earth. This is, for example, these are the animals found in a single trip, a collecting trip, monitoring species in the depths of the Pacific. And in this particular one, they found the largest animal on Earth, and a worm-like animal, 47 meters long. Unfortunately, as I said, what we're happening right now, we're facing an unprecedented biodiversity loss. This is probably the most urgent problem and one of the most challenging problems that humanity has faced. The current situation is that we have so many severe global environmental problems, and all of them are caused by human population growth, inequity, consumption, and the use of inefficient technologies like fossil fuels. This has caused us these global problems like climate disruption, habitat loss, overexploitation, emerging diseases, and so on, has pushed us to a larger magnitude of species and population losses on the one hand, and whole ecosystems on the other. And together, this means that we're losing ecosystem services as goods, and those ecosystem services and goods, as I'm going to explain, are essential to maintaining life on Earth in general and human life on Earth in particular. We recently published with Paul Ehrlich and other people this paper underestimating the challenges for avoiding a ghastly future. And basically what we find in this paper is that even our predictions, even what we know, doesn't give us a whole good idea of the magnitude of the problem when this all put together. Even us as scientists working on these very dreadful problems cannot grasp the magnitude of the problems. And particularly in what I am expert on is the extinction rates. And a few years ago with Paul Ehrlich and other colleagues, what we did is to try to analyze if the current extinction rates were normal in the sense were similar rates to what happened in the last few million years, or they were elevated, meaning that we are entering a mass extinction. And to be honest, when we started the study, we knew that the current rates will be elevated because so many species are becoming extinct, but we never thought that what we want to find out was as bad as we find. And basically, almost 1,000 vertebrates species has become extinct in the last 500 years, most of them in the last 100 years. Fortunately for us, there is two kinds of information that allows to put this into perspective. First, in the last 600 million years, there has been 5 mass extinction, and those mass extinction basically are extinction rates, periods where extinction rates goes and become very elevated, much more elevated to the normal extinction rates or background extinction rates. And those 5 extinction rates, mass extinction rates, have several characteristics in common. On the one hand, they were caused by a catastrophe, a natural catastrophe like the impact of a meteorite. Second, they were very fast in geological terms, happening in hundreds of thousands or a few million years. And third, they evaporated 70% or more of all the species on Earth. The second important part when we did this study is that our colleague, Tony Barnowski from Berkeley, and his colleagues have put together a few years ago a paper where they have been able to evaluate what was the extinction rate of mammals in the last few million years. And that study was based on the records of literally hundreds of thousands records of fossil mammals. And what they found basically is a complex scenario, but the extinction rate, the normal extinction rate in the last 2 million years basically can be translated to this. You will expect to lose 2 species for every 10,000 species present at a time every 100 years. In other words, in a particular century, if you have 10,000 species, in normal time you will expect 2 extinction. If you have 20,000 species present, you will find 4 extinction. And if you have only 5,000 species, you will expect 1 extinction. That becomes an incredibly important piece of knowledge that will allow us to understand what was the current extinction rate. And based on our results, we published this paper, Accelerated Modern Human-Induced Species Losses, Entering the 6th Mass Extinction, because what we found out was that the species that has become in the last 500 years in general, but mostly in the last century in particular, we can see here in this in the left, you can see the much elevated rates of mammals, all the vertebrates, birds, and so on. You see on the bottom, a dotted line, that will be the background extinction rate. That will be if the current extinction rate was similar to what happened in the last few million years, then the lines, the color lines, will be below that. But what you can see, it is much higher. That's the first thing. I mean, the extinction rate in the last 500 years has been much more elevated than the background extinction rate of the last few million years. And the second, you can see on the right, see, that there is almost a perfect, correlation between extinction rate and human population. It's 0.999. That means that a human population, it is related to the loss of this species almost perfectly. In summary, from that paper, what we find out is that the species lost in the last 100 years of vertebrates, mammals, birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fishes, should be lost in 10,000 years following normal times extinction rates. And now, based on our data and the data of many other groups on plants and invertebrates, and butterflies, and so on, the extinction rates are between 10 to 10,000 faster, meaning what we lost in the last 100 years should have lost in between 100 and 10,000 times faster. This means species lost in the last 100 years would have been lost between 10,000 to 100,000 years. The number is so big that it's impossible to understand. The magnitude of this is impossible to understand. But then, what we have focused our studies is not only populations, it's not only species what is matter, but it's also population extinction. Because a species become extinct when all its populations are lost. That means, by definition then, that the population extinction is more severe than a species extinction. And I will also mention why population extinction become very relevant at the local and the regional scales. We published this paper in 2017, and as the previous one become also viral in the internet. It was covered in all the news and newspapers, blogs, etc. Somebody made an estimate that probably between 100 and 500 million people were exposed to this paper in the first 4 weeks after it was published. And here, what we look at, if you see the map on the right, there's the historic and the current population geographic range of lions. And as you can see, lions has become, they have disappeared for a massive, basically from all Asia, except from a tiny population in India, in the Gir forest. And also, it is all fragmented that has appeared from many places in Africa. When we did this infograph, something like 10 years ago, there were 34,000 lions remaining. Now there are around 23,000. That's how fast things are going. So we call this paper biological annihilation by the ongoing 6 mass extinction signaled by vertebrate population losses and decline. Because what we managed to show here is that more than 27,000 species of vertebrates, 32% of them are losing population. And this includes very abundant, less abundant, rare, and very rare species, the whole array of species. So, in other words, we're losing species at a really fast rate, and we're losing populations at a really fast rate. And we call it annihilation, of the biological annihilation, because this is a really unprecedented, massive assault on wildlife, on animals. And you can see here the population had declined of the forest elephants in Africa, and every 30 minutes an African elephant is killed illegally for its ivory. As 8% of the population is lost every year, and at this rate there could be no elephants in 10 or 15 years. There are studies by other groups. This is from the Living Planet, from World Wildlife Fund, and it shows that 39% of the terrestrial vertebrates has declined around, that terrestrial vertebrates have declined around 39% between 1970 and 2010, and 76% of the freshwater species like frogs and toads, and 39% of the marine species. This is what it shows, is that the massive losses of animals, individual animals and populations. And just to give you an idea of all the biomass left of birds on Earth, 70% are basically chicken and other poultry. And only 30% of that biomass is divided among 11,000 species of wild birds. So the concentration of biomass is gigantic on poultry. The same thing is happening with when we see livestock and so on. So what are the causes of the decline globally? You know them all, but basically exploitation, hunting and overfishing, habitat degradation, habitat loss, climate change, invasive species, pollution, diseases, and so on. These are the causes directly or indirectly related to human activities that are putting species and populations to extinction. And I give you an example that not only big animals are being lost. This is what's happened with invertebrates. This is an example in Germany. 75% of the biomass of insects were lost in 27 years. Well, we know, and it will be discussed in further detail, that population growth, consumption, and technology are causing these problems. The drivers, the proximate drivers are first, habitat loss. Just to give you an idea, 90% of the tropical forests of Asia remaining in 2000 were lost in 19 years. And what we can see in this map is those places, dark places, are areas where most land is under urban landscapes, agriculture, or cattle. We know that global climate disruption is starting to hit hard. It will be much harder in the future, and it will cause more impact on population and species. The other driver that I want to emphasize here that is incredibly important is overexploitation and illegal trade. We know now that the illegal trade is so big that, for instance, animals like pangolin has lost an estimated 96% of the population in the last 20 years. A pangolin can cost $5,000 in a restaurant in China. And this is a pangolin pit where these pangolins, 3,000 pangolins, were confiscated and are being destroyed in Indonesia, I think. Wildlife trades and habitat loss are the two of the root causes responsible for the brunt of the problem of losing populations and the species. And this is, we're still waiting for the big impact of climate change. And the recent COVID, we all know that the recent COVID and many other pandemic and epidemic zoonotic diseases are related to illegal trade of animals. And see the famous wet markets on the left. You will see what they call wet market because the floor are wet with blood and water and all kind of waste. And on the left, on the right, you can see this person eating while he's eating in a place where they have cages with animals in very filthy conditions, very unethical conditions. You have there wild and domestic animals in the perfect conditions to get diseases transmitted to each other. This is why COVID jumped from a wild animal to domestic animals or to humans. And this is what has happened in the last 40 years with something like 40 to 50 epidemic, some of them very deadly diseases like Ebola. To give you an idea of the size of the problem, in China alone, over 100 million individuals of wild animals are used every single year, generating $74 billion in profit. That's more than all the combined profit from the US market, beef market profits. So why does it matter? Why does it matter? Well, it matters for so many reasons. It matters. There are political, there are religious, there are cultural, there are ethical, there are moral, there are economic reasons. Perhaps the most important, it matters because we get the environmental services that are all the benefits provided by wild plants, animals, and microorganisms to humans and to other animals and other plants. The clean water, essential for human survival, the proper combination for the gases of the atmosphere, and so on, are environmental services provided by the wild plants and animals of this planet. Indeed, there could be no life on Earth if there were no wild plants and animals. And we're killing them, so we're killing the possibilities, we're destroying the possibilities of Earth to maintain life in general and to maintain human life in particular. Another example of some of these ecosystem services is pollination. 75% of the crops that we use, human use, are pollinated totally or partially by animals. Bats, insects, bees, birds. Well, what can we do? So basically, what we can do is what we're doing today. Is that we have to stop being spectators. We have to become actors. And in this particular sense, it is incredibly important to understand that by losing populations, we're losing the ecosystem services at the local and the regional scale. And this is important to mention because, for instance, it doesn't matter that there are jaguars in Brazil, jaguars that disappear in Mexico, because the role that jaguars play in the forests of Mexico is gone. Those species, local species of populations, are like a global species. Local extinctions of populations are like global extinctions of species. This is a paper was published recently and shows particular trends. If we do nothing, how can we go to ruin? But if we do an effort in the next few years, in the next few decades, we can probably help to change the whole outcome. We think that what's happening with plants and animals in the next 15 years, what we can do to save most of the species in danger with extinction in the next 10 to 15 years is what is going to define what's happened with biodiversity on Earth in the long run. And I finish with this. We're working on a new initiative. It's called People versus Extinction, where we are building this platform to galvanize mass education, engagement, and action in response to climate change and species extinction. Thank you very much.